How about another hand for Carla Fabris? Thank you. Tucson Medical Center has been with us since the very beginning, from happiness all the way through, and we're very grateful. Wow, big crowd. Welcome, everyone. This is the College of Social and Behavioral Sciences' 7th annual Downtown Lecture Series. My name is John Paul Jones. I'm the Don Bennett Moon Dean of the College of SBS, the University of Arizona's People College. We have a lot of special people here in the audience, but since we're doing a series on animals, I thought I would take this opportunity to introduce to you the leader of the newest college at the University of Arizona, the College of Veterinary Medicine, and she's with us here tonight, Dr. Julie Funk. Now, for the People College, Julie's probably saying, what are you guys doing working on animals? No, she wouldn't say that. Because we all know that animals are seriously important for social relationships and also even for social structures. But animalities, well, if you go to Google and you look up animalities, you're going to find somebody who mauls people in Mortal Kombat 3. So if you came for Mortal Kombat 3, let me remind you of the flight attendant who comes on the intercom and says, if Tucson is not your destination, will you please get off the plane? Animalities is a relatively new field of social and cultural studies. Some of the founding books in this field are behind me on the screen here. Interestingly, most of these have been published within the last 3 years. It's a field that takes as its object of analysis the relationships between humans and the non-human, but it does so not from a traditional way of looking at it from social science or the humanities, but rather from the standpoint that animals have agency and that we can give them voice in understanding their impact on our social lives. And some scholars in this area even go so far as to try to suspend their own learned humanism, their own humanistic ways of understanding the world, to try to predicate an analysis which is based on the non-human itself. The thinking dog, for example. What would an animal think? And how does that help form us as social beings? Well, we have a really stellar group of presenters over the course of the next 4 Thursdays, and I know there are a lot of dog lovers in the audience, but let me say, even if you've never loved a bison or a herring or a horse, I really encourage you to come to the other talks. They're all fabulous and fascinating. Let me make a few words of thanks to people who have been very important to sustaining this series. Our series sponsors, Halualua Companies, and I want to thank Mike and Beth Kasser. SBS Advisory Board members, Ken and Linda Robin. Supporting sponsor, Arizona Public Media. It's been great to work with Jack and especially with the fabulous technical team here behind the curtain. Our community sponsors are the doctors Vivi and Adib Sabah, Joanne Ellison and Barbara Starrett, Maynard's Market and Kitchen, and Hotel Congress. Thank you, Richard and Shana Oseron. Park Tucson, I hope they got you all here tonight. And not last, I want to give a special thanks to this historic Fox Tucson Theater, a wonderful place to have partnered with over the 7 years. And I somehow feel that we have contributed to the traffic problem that you all experience here tonight. I also want to thank Craig Sumberg, who many of you know, if you're a patron of the Fox, that he will be leaving at the end of this month. And we really wish him the best in New York, and it's been a great pleasure to work with him and his staff. Craig, thank you. And now it's my great pleasure to introduce our speaker tonight. I know you're panting in anticipation. Dr. Evan MacLean is an assistant professor in the School of Anthropology in the College of SBS and also director of the Arizona Canine Cognition Center. He earned his PhD in evolutionary anthropology at Duke University and came to us a few years ago. And in that time, he's published some 40 articles and book chapters and brought in well over $1 million in funding, and publishes in journals like Psychoneuroendocrinology, which is just one word. He is not only an expert in dogs, but an expert in primates, and particularly on the evolutionary, behavioral, and cognitive aspects of lemurs and bonobos and chimpanzees. So he brings a lot to the university. His dog work, as you can imagine, is extremely popular, and that has found him in just a huge amount of press. He regularly is cited in the New York Times, the Washington Post, NPR, BBC, Wired, Science, Time, all over the place. And he maintains a really rigorous schedule of flying around the world, flying nationally and flying around the world, to give talks on the work of himself and his colleagues and his students in the Arizona Canine Cognition Center, including a most prestigious talk this year at the Tucson Kennel Club. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Dr. Evan MacLean.
Thanks, JP. Well, good evening. Thank you very much, JP, and thanks so much to all of you for coming out tonight. It's amazing to see so many people here, and I can just hope that you're all dog lovers. That's a good sign. So I want to start tonight with a puzzle. And it's something that might not strike many of you as puzzling, because it's something that comes quite naturally to us. But it's a puzzle nonetheless. And that is that about half of us have chosen to share our lives and open up our homes to the evolutionary descendants of gray wolves. Now, wolves, of course, are majestic animals, truly charismatic megafauna, but they're also dangerous carnivores, and their primary form of interaction with other mammals consists of eating them. So it's a little bit strange that we have such a cozy relationship with dogs. In recent history, we have done everything we can to keep wolves away from us. So historically, wolves roamed freely throughout North America. This map that you're looking at here shows the historic range of the gray wolf in the United States. But by the year 1960, we saw wolves as such threats to our livelihoods that we had completely extirpated them from our country. We're not the only country to have done this. Wolves have been extirpated from other places like England, France, and Japan. And our fear of wolves is something that we even see, for example, in our children's stories. where we have characters like the Three Little Pigs and Little Red Riding Hood, who must always constantly beware the big, bad wolf. Yet in spite of all of this, we have managed to negotiate a very different kind of relationship with dogs. Yeah, I don't know how many of you would try this photograph with your firstborn and a wolf, but I am not in that group. Our relationship with dogs, of course, is nothing new. So while there's a lot of debate about the particulars of dog domestication, including when it happened, where it happened, how and why, there's broad agreement that dogs were the first domesticated species, and that when this happened, it fundamentally changed the way that humans related to other animals. So in subsequent talks in this lecture series, you're going to hear about the importance of diverse species in the livelihoods of humans, including animals like horses, bison, and even herring. What's remarkable to me about dogs is that the very evolution of their species depended on the ability to live in an anthropogenic or human environment. This is something that happened at least 10,000 years ago, but possibly as long ago as 30 to 40,000 years ago. And to put that in perspective, you have to think for a moment about what the lives of humans were like at that time. Prior to about 10,000 years ago, we had not yet developed agriculture. So humans were living predominantly as hunter-gatherers, living off the land in relatively transient populations without the civilizations and settlements that we think of today. But already at that time, dogs were an important part of the lives of humans. We know this through a combination of genetic and archaeological evidence, some of which is just amazing to think about. As a quick warning, the next slide I want to show you has an image of human remains, so if you prefer not to see that, I'd ask that you just avert your gaze for just a moment. Now, those of you that are looking at the screen, what you see here, this is a burial site from Israel about 12,000 years ago. And what you're looking at is not only the body of a woman, but in her arms, she is cradling the body of a dog. So this tells us that already by 12,000 years ago, our relationships with dogs were much more than utilitarian in their nature. It wasn't just that dogs were good hunting partners or guards, but we had emotional connections to dogs, which sometimes even transcended death. The question I want to ask tonight is why dogs? So why dogs and not any of the other thousands of animals that might have fallen into this role? Is there something about the way that dogs think about the world or communicate with us that is different than other species? Do they have some secret in terms of how they win our hearts and befriend us? I think the answer to these questions is yes, and tonight I want to explore some of the reasons why we think this is the case. We think about these kinds of questions in my research group, the Arizona Canine Cognition Center, in part out of sheer curiosity about dogs. But for me, the original reason that I began studying dogs had little to do with dogs themselves and was much more about a question involving our own species. By training, I am an evolutionary anthropologist, and what that means is that I'm trained to think about questions relating to human evolution. And when I came to U of A in 2016, this was 1 year after the centennial celebration for the School of Anthropology, so 100 years of anthropology at the University of Arizona. And when I got here, there was all kinds of paraphernalia from this event all over our department, including this sticker that you see up here on the screen in front of you. And it may not seem like it, but what this sticker does is actually a pretty incredible thing, because it boils down the incredibly diverse field of anthropology into a single question that all anthropologists ask. And that question is, what does it mean to be human? When I saw this, it really resonated with me, because I have spent my career asking a slightly different question, in fact, the opposite question. And that question is, what does it mean not to be human? So from our perspective, we can never even begin to understand what it means to be human and what our place in the world is if we don't understand what it's like to be another animal, what their experiences of the world are like. And for the first part of my career, I thought about this question predominantly by looking at humans in an evolutionary context, comparing humans to our closest living evolutionary relatives, the other great apes, including animals like gorillas and orangutans, but most importantly, our closest relatives, chimpanzees and bonobos, who we are equally related to and share a last common ancestor with about 7 million years ago. The logic for this work was pretty simple. So the general thing we do is we try to design cognitive tests, nonverbal tests, that can be used similarly with humans and with other apes. The idea is that if we can identify areas in which the psychology of these species is similar and different, then maybe we can use that information to begin to piece together how it is that we have evolved to be the unusual animals that we are. So what would I say about this question? What is it that makes the human mind different than the minds of, say, a chimpanzee or a bonobo? Is it possible that humans are simply smarter than chimps and bonobos somehow? Well, we would say that that is the wrong kind of question to ask. The reason we think that's the wrong question is that we don't think about intelligence as being a one-dimensional construct. We don't think about intelligence as being some kind of ladder on which species can occupy higher or lower rungs. Instead, we think about intelligence as being a constellation of different abilities, many of which are finely tuned to the specific kinds of problems that animals have to solve in nature. So just in the same way that evolution can sculpt animal bodies to help them deal with the physical challenges they face in the world, evolution can similarly specialize the mind to deal with the specific kinds of problems that species face in their survival and reproduction. Let me give you an example. So this little bird here, this is a Clark's nutcracker. It's a corvid species that lives in the western parts of North America, tends to live high up in the mountainous regions. And in that environment, there are periods when food is very, very scarce. So these birds tend to make a living by eating pine seeds. And what they have to do is they have to take these seeds in times of plenty, and they have to hide them away in places. So in the depths of winter, they can try and find these caches of food so they have something to eat when food is not otherwise available. What's amazing is that any given nutcracker might hide seeds in about 6,000 different places. Then a period of 6 to 8 months later, these birds come back and they recover nearly all of those caches. So this is a 5-ounce bird with a brain maybe the size of an almond, and it remembers where 6,000 things are over a period of 6 to 8 months. I'm up here, 88 billion neurons of human brain, and I can't find my car keys in the morning. That is humbling from an evolutionary perspective. What's amazing is that if you take these birds into a laboratory environment and you compare them to close relatives and different kinds of problems, you see interesting things. So if you compare Clark's nutcrackers to other corvids on their ability to remember spatial information, to remember where things are, well, they're much, much better than these other birds. And this makes sense because they depend on these skills for survival and reproduction. But if you ask them just a slightly different problem, another test of memory, but now they have to remember something about color, not about space, what you find is that these birds are really no different than other corvids. So to me, this is a beautiful example of the way in which evolution can impart great expertise for solving one kind of problem that is important for a species' survival and reproduction, but not necessarily another. So if we take this kind of thinking and we bring it back to a question about our own species and what makes our species unique, I'd say that we don't want to ask this question of how smart are humans. But what we can do is we can rearrange the words in this sentence to ask a much more interesting question, and that is the question of how are humans smart? You'll find a lot of ideas about what people think makes humans smart, but one idea that is very well supported is that human intelligence is fundamentally social in its nature. These are a couple of plots from a study that I think shows this very elegantly. And what happened in this study is that 2-year-old human children were compared to other great apes, chimpanzees and orangutans, on their ability to solve a range of different kinds of problems. When those problems required animals to think about their physical environment, so to think about things like space or number or the properties of a simple tool, what the researchers found is that human children are not terribly different from other great apes in those contexts. In contrast, when you look at how these individuals solve problems relating to the social world, and particularly problems involving cooperation and communication with others, already by 2 years of age, human children are doing things that other apes never will. We see this by 2 years of age, but in fact, this distinctly human kind of intelligence emerges much earlier in development. It develops before children acquire their first word. And we know that these social cognitive skills actually provide the foundation that children need to go on and acquire language. I'll give you a quick example of what I mean by this. So this is a seemingly very simple communicative act here, right? The act of pointing. And superficially, when you look at this, there's not much to it, right? One person points, the other person looks. That's all there is. But it turns out to make meaning out of these kinds of communicative exchanges, we actually have to make some somewhat complicated inferences about what the other person is trying to tell us. So you might reason that she thinks there's something that you don't know, and if you look where she's pointing, you'll come to understand what it is that she wants you to know. That's a lot of sort of work to do under the hood. So it's a basic nonverbal kind of communication, and it is rooted in an inference that fundamentally what the other person is trying to do is to help you in some way. This is something that you'll find in human cultures around the world, but it's something that other apes tend not to do. This is a video from part of my dissertation work working with chimpanzees in Africa, and what you're going to see here is a very simple experiment in which a chimpanzee struggles. So what's going to happen is there are 2 containers here. I'm going to place a piece of banana in one of those containers. The chimpanzee doesn't see where. And then I'm just very simply going to point to tell the chimpanzee where the food is. So you can see that the ape sees my gesture, but what she doesn't understand is that I'm trying to help her in some way. And this makes a lot of sense if you think about what the lives of chimpanzees are like. If I were a chimpanzee and I knew where there was a piece of hidden food that I could potentially get for myself, the last thing I would do would be to tell you about that. So the last thing I expect is that if you're in possession of that kind of information, that you're going to voluntarily share it with me. Well, it turns out there is a non-human species that does not find this kind of communication to be particularly difficult. And of course, it's the animal that I'm here to talk about tonight, the dog. So when we compare hundreds of dogs, young human children, and other apes on these kinds of problems involving cooperative communication, we find that dogs perform much more like human children than any of the other great apes do. This is in contrast to what we see if we look at these individuals' ability to solve a different kind of problem, a problem involving reasoning about the physical world. So this is a quick video showing something that we have yet to find a dog who can do well in this kind of context. So the reward goes there. Now it moves. The dog searches. And that's typically what we see in this situation. And this is because dogs don't use the kinds of skills that they need to regarding object permanence and spatial cognition. They don't seem to understand that when the container moves, the thing that's in the container moves with it. So this gets back to the central idea of how we think about intelligence. Because again, for us, the question is not how smart are dogs, but it's the question of how are dogs smart. And we think that dogs are smart in some of the same ways that people are. Okay, so some of you are probably skeptical here, and that's great. I'm glad you're skeptical about what I'm telling you because skepticism is at the heart of science. We teach our students to be skeptical about everything, to think about alternative explanations for the phenomena that they observe. And of course, there are a number of reasons why dogs might do well in these kinds of cognitive tests, whereas other animals don't. One obvious reason is basically what you're looking at. So dogs live in a human world, and for better or worse, they have all kinds of opportunities to watch us do the weird things we do and learn about what those things mean. So surely it's possible that we could take another species and we could put them in the same environment and give them all kinds of exposure to the strange things that people do, and maybe they would start to respond to human gestures in the way that dogs do. Well, we have done systematic experiments where we try to do exactly this. We have worked with other great apes that have had intensive contact with humans from the time they were infants. And even if they slowly come to understand the meaning of one particular kind of gesture, they don't generalize this knowledge to other similar communicative acts. So it's as if there's something about the fundamental premise of this kind of communication that doesn't make sense to apes. Another piece of evidence that this is something that is really rooted in dogs' biology comes from a series of studies that we have done with young animals like this, 8- and 9-week-old dogs. Now, for those of you who don't know much about dog development, it helps to know that dogs are effectively born blind. So their eyes are closed when they're born. They don't open their eyes until about 2 weeks into development. And then once they do open their eyes, they have to go through a period of a couple weeks where their brains start to make sense of the visual input that they're getting. So by the time a dog is 8 or 9 weeks old, they have very little visual experience with the world. And quite frankly, it's a miracle that we can get these puppies to participate in any of the studies that we do. But I am lucky because I have a brilliant postdoc who works in my lab, Emily Bray. And Emily has perfected the art of testing young puppies in cognitive experiments. I'll show you an example of what this looks like. So this is an 8-week-old dog in a communication task here. So there's food in one cup. The dog doesn't know where.
Puppy, look. Okay. Tracy, good boy. Oh, you got it.
We hire for attitude in my lab. Here's something else that is maybe even a little bit more impressive, because what you're going to see here is essentially a communicative act invented on the spot. So the researcher here is going to pick up a little yellow wooden block. It's something the dog has never seen before. It has no meaning for the dog. But she's going to look the dog in the eyes and show this block as if to say, I'm about to tell you something important using this thing.
Trial 3. Puppy, look. Puppy, look. Puppy, look. Okay. Good girl. Girl, share. Yes.
So what you see there is the dog doesn't run over to the block. It's not about the block. There's an understanding that the block is being used as a communicative tool to convey some information about where the food is. And at this point, we have tested more than 300 8 to 9-week-old puppies in these kinds of tasks. And what we see is they do incredibly well. So in this figure here, this white dashed line, this is chance expectation. So there's 2 places the dogs can search. If they don't know what they're doing, it's basically a coin toss kind of scenario. So we expect that they'll be right 50% of the time. And what we find is that by 8 and 9 weeks of age, puppies are doing much, much better than that. Now, another thing that probably some of you are skeptical about is that, well, these are dogs. They have an incredible sense of olfaction. So aren't they finding the food using their noses? The answer there is also no. So we run these explicit control trials where everything is the same. Food is hidden in one of the 2 places. The only difference is that we don't give the dog any sort of communicative information about where to look. We look where they look when left to their own devices. And what we find is that in those situations, puppies are exactly at 50%. So they're not using their noses in these tasks. They're using the information from people. One of the things about this study that is more remarkable to me is that we can find strong genetic influences on these traits in dogs. So we were fortunate in that of all the puppies that we worked with, we knew exactly how every individual dog was related to every other dog. And this allows us to look at something called heritability. Heritability is a measure that describes the proportion of variance in some trait in a population that is attributable to genetic factors. And when we do these kinds of quantitative genetic analyses, taking into account information about how puppies are related to each other and how they do in these tasks, we find that just shy of half of the variation in 8 and 9-week-old dogs is attributable to genetic factors. So the combination of evidence that this emerges early in development, it doesn't require lots of exposure to people, and that we can find strong genetic contributions driving individual differences in this context, suggests that this is something that is really rooted in dog biology. Now, importantly, it's also not something that dogs seem to have inherited from wolves. These are 2 graduate students in my lab, Gita Nanadesakan and Daniel Horschler. And they had the unusual opportunity of spending a summer in Minnesota a couple of years ago. Their job was to go out to a wildlife science sanctuary and spend every waking moment of the day with a litter of wolf puppies. So it is cute. Wolf puppies are naturally a little bit fearful of people, so if you want to do anything with them, you have to go out of your way to make friends with them. So these guys were feeding them, playing with them, they were even sleeping with them sometimes. And if you think that trying to sleep while wolf puppies are running all over you and mosquitoes and black flies are biting you, I can promise that these pictures make it look a lot more enjoyable than some of it was. But even when we do that, even when we give wolves all kinds of exposure to people, we can't turn a wolf puppy into a dog puppy. So when we test wolf puppies on these kinds of things and we compare them to dogs, we have dogs in blue here, wolves in white, we see really robust differences between these species. So this suggests that something important changed during domestication, something that allowed dogs to begin doing something that we think is central to what makes us human. And we think that a lot of this was probably rooted in a change to dogs' emotional systems. Some of the best evidence that changes to emotional systems are important here comes from what I think is maybe the greatest science experiment that has ever been run, in part because it's a 50-year experiment, a 5-decade-long experiment that was done by a Russian geneticist named Dmitry Belyaev. Belyaev thought that in domestication, the key was changes to emotional systems. And he worked with silver foxes, and he had this idea that maybe he could somehow selectively breed foxes to create foxes that had emotional dispositions like those of dogs. So they had a very simple protocol for doing this. They were working on these silver fox farms, and researchers would approach foxes in cages. They would open the door, and they would reach a hand in towards the fox, and they would look at how the fox responded. Now, most of the foxes were fearful or aggressive towards the person. They're not domesticated animals, so someone opening a door and reaching a hand in is a potentially threatening thing. And the foxes that behaved fearfully or aggressively in that context were bred in one line of animals. But they took the subset of animals who had the least fearful, the least aggressive reactions to people, and they bred them in another line. They also had a third line of foxes that they bred irrespective of their behavior in these contexts. And over generations, what they tried to do was to continue to select for foxes that were less and less fearful of people to see if they could create evolutionary changes to their emotional systems. They were wildly successful. So eventually, they were able to produce foxes that not only weren't fearful of people, but that were happy when people opened the door to their cages. So some of these foxes would vocalize and wag their tails and roll over for the researchers to pet their bellies. So this showed that this had strong genetic control, and through selection, they could begin to produce foxes that had emotional characteristics like dogs. One of the amazing things about this experiment, though, is that a whole bunch of other things happened that nobody was predicting. So these foxes that were bred for tameability over time, their bodies began to change. They spontaneously developed floppy ears. They developed curly tails, white patches of fur in places like the center of their forehead, on their chest, the tips of their tails, their paws. They developed shorter and rounder faces. And these are the very characteristics that differentiate dogs from wolves. When Brian Hare went to Siberia and he tested these foxes on their ability to use gestural communication from humans, he found a difference between the line of foxes bred for friendliness and the control line that is quite analogous to the difference that I've talked about with respect to dogs and wolves. So what this tells us is that through evolutionary changes to emotional systems, animals can come to view others in new ways. They can come to see others as potentially cooperative partners in ways they didn't before. Now, these are some of the very changes that we think were important in the evolution of our own species. So the question is, how did this happen to humans? Is it possible that humans went through an evolutionary process like that in dog domestication, or like that what happened here with the silver foxes? Well, you may be surprised to know that it is a hypothesis that is being taken very seriously in evolutionary anthropology. These are just a few recent titles of scientific articles published dealing with the hypothesis of human self-domestication. And when you look at the ways that human bodies have changed in recent evolution, there are changes in human anatomy that mirror the very kinds of changes that we see in domestication. So setting aside the issue for a moment of whether humans are a domesticated species, the core idea here is that what has happened is that humans and dogs have gone through what's called convergent evolution. And convergent evolution is the phenomenon when distantly related species arise at the same evolutionary solution to a common problem. The classic example of this is something like flight. So flight has evolved independently in birds and mammals and reptiles and insects. And all of these animals fly not because they inherited the capacity for flight from a common ancestor, but because flight was independently adaptive in each of these lineages. So the idea that dogs and humans have been through convergent evolution is exciting for a number of reasons. First, it may help to explain how it is that dogs and humans are able to do such remarkable things together. But secondly, it tells us that perhaps by studying dogs and the process through which dogs became dogs, we might learn something about the evolution of our own species as well. So dogs get us. They intuitively understand our gestures and read into our body language, and I think no doubt this is an important part of how it is that we're able to do such amazing things together with them. But there's also more to it than this, right? Because our connection with dogs is also a deeply emotional one. And this is what I want to turn to in the second part of the talk tonight. When you ask Americans how they think about their dogs, more than 90% of dog owners will tell you that they think of their dogs as members of their family. In fact, about half of these people will say that the dog is just as important as any other member of the family. And we get a great deal of emotional satisfaction from these relationships. In fact, there was a recent survey in which about half of married women reported getting more emotional satisfaction. You don't even know where I'm going. More emotional satisfaction in their relationship with their dog than their husband. I think you did know where I was going. So there's a couple things about that, right? So number one, it's funny and it's sad, but number two, it's amazing when you stop and think about it, right? Because this is a human who is getting more emotional satisfaction from a relationship with a non-human animal than from the person she has chosen to spend the rest of her life with. It's not just adults that feel this way. So if you ask school-age children about their pets, kids will tell you that they have less conflict and more satisfaction in their relationships with dogs than siblings. And many school-age children will say that their dog is more important than their best friend and equally important to their parents when it comes to having someone to be around in tough times. So we think about dogs as members of our family. But how exactly dogs fit into families is something, again, that researchers are not quite sure about. There's a number of different ideas here, but one idea that I think is provocative and which there's some pretty good evidence for is that people often think about their dogs as children. I think this is not an accident. In fact, I think there are features of dogs, ranging from aspects of their outward appearance to the specific kinds of behavioral interactions they have with us, that force our brains, and I would maybe even say deceive our brains, into responding to them as children. In evolution, there is a very strong selective pressure for animals to recognize and respond to their young in nurturing ways. And as a consequence of this, many animal brains have specialized mechanisms that help them to identify their young and care for them in the ways they need. At the same time, baby animals of many species have characteristic signals that they emit that identify them as such and solicit these kinds of caretaking responses from older individuals. This is an idea that was developed by the Dutch ethologist Konrad Lorenz. And Lorenz coined this term kindschema. And what kindschema translates to is literally baby schema. And this is what researchers think is the biological basis of why we find some things to be cute. What Lorenz showed is that across many different species, the infants tend to have characteristic features that differentiate them from older individuals, adult individuals. So infants of these different species tend to have relatively large heads compared to the rest of their body. They have short faces, they have big, round eyes. And when you see these kinds of things, you can't help but want to respond to them in nurturing ways. So maybe it's not a surprise then that companies like Disney have figured out just how strongly we respond to these kinds of cues. When you look at Bambi here with these oversized eyes compared to anything you would see in a natural animal. Well, when it comes to dogs, dogs are basically like the Disney version of wolves. If Disney had never seen a dog, they'd only seen wolves, and you said, okay, we'll turn this thing into a character, this is what they would create. I promise you, it would look like that. So one idea is that through domestication, dogs have come to retain infantile and juvenile characteristics that wolves have when they're young, but which wolves grow out of. And this is true both in terms of the way that dogs look, but also in terms of their behaviors. So wolf puppies do all kinds of things like barking all the time, wagging their tails, engaging in high levels of social play. But as they get older, the frequency of those behaviors plummets. Dogs do these things not only when they're young, but they do them into adulthood as well. So I think in this sense, if you think about dogs, they're kind of like the Peter Pans of the wolf world, and that they get older, they just never grow up. Dogs have some good tricks for doing this. This is work that came out just this year, led by Julian Kaminsky. And what they showed in this study is that if you compare the facial musculature of dogs and wolves, dogs have a set of muscles right here, right around their orbits, that allows them to make a particular kind of facial expression, the one you're seeing here, where they raise their eyebrows up. These are the iconic puppy dog eyes. And what this does is it accentuates the sort of childlike nature of that appearance. So wolves tend not to make these facial expressions, and it turns out that one of the reasons they don't do it is they literally don't have the muscles to make puppy dog eyes. We know that we respond very, very strongly to these kinds of cues as well. So in studies of adoptions of dogs from shelters, it's the dogs that make the most of these pediomorphic expressions that highlight their baby-like characteristics. Those are the dogs that tend to get adopted the quickest. Similarly, if you put human mothers in a functional magnetic resonance imaging experiment, so a brain scanning experiment, and you show these women pictures of their own child, their own dog, compared to other children and other dogs, you get remarkably similar patterns of neural activation when women are looking at their own child and their own dog. So it's as if the brain sees dogs and our children in a very similar kind of category here. So the final thing I want to turn to tonight thinks a little bit about the consequences of these kinds of responses, these kinds of connections with dogs. And I think on the one hand, we could be a little bit cynical about this. You could advance an argument that what dogs are doing is hijacking our brains. So they have these baby-like features, and this causes us to shower them with all kinds of things, anything their doggy hearts desire, and that this comes at some cost to us, right? We could think of this as a parasitic relationship. I mean, I think a textbook definition of a parasite in biology is something like an organism that makes a living at the expense of the host and which has evolved to do this. I know you would boo me out of this theater if that was what I left you with tonight, though. Because I don't think that's true. I think that would be a mischaracterization of our relationship with dogs. I think we get a lot out of these relationships ourselves. but it's something that we're only beginning to understand from a scientific perspective. One thing that social scientists have known for decades is that our health is predicted not just by things like eating the right food, getting enough exercise, but also by the quality of our social relationships with others. So researchers in anthrozoology, which is the systematic study of human-animal interactions, have begun to ask questions about whether our social relationships with non-human animals are similarly protective of our health. One of the pioneering studies in this regard was work that was done by Erica Friedman. And what this research group did is they were looking at a population of patients who had heart attacks. They were admitted to a coronary care unit, and they followed these patients after they were discharged from that medical facility, trying to identify features of who would be resilient from disease and who would succumb to disease. There were two big findings in this study. The first finding is that social support mattered a lot. So people who had a strong network of friends and family were much more likely to still be alive and doing well 1 year after a heart attack compared to people who had less social connections. That was an important finding, but it was also a little bit unsurprising because this happened during a time when researchers were beginning to recognize just how important our relationships with other people were for our health. The second big finding that came out of this study, though, was a big surprise. And that was that people with pets at home, and the majority of these pets were dogs, were about 5 times more likely to still be alive 1 year after a heart attack compared to people without pets. And this really changed the way that people thought about pets, because people began to wonder, well, is it possible that these same things that support our health through our connections with other people, is it possible that our social connections to non-human animals can protect our health in the same way? So one of the things we are interested in my lab is trying to understand the biological mechanisms through which our relationships with animals may impact our health, and how those same mechanisms may impact the health of our pets as well. And in this regard, we have become particularly interested in a molecule named oxytocin. Oxytocin is a name that might be familiar to many of you because it's an important hormone in mammalian birth and lactation. And although it was originally conceived of and thought about primarily as a female reproductive hormone, one thing that researchers have discovered in recent decades is that oxytocin also plays very important roles in our social relationships and social emotions as well. And this begins with the very first social relationship we have in life, and that is the bond between a mother and a child. So when mothers interact with their babies in ways like that shown on the screen here, interactions involving affectionate touch, gazing into one another's eyes, this can release oxytocin in both the mother and the child. And in the brain, oxytocin is involved in circuits that are involved with emotional processing and reward processing. So when oxytocin is released in the brain, this is one mechanism that helps our brains to recognize that these are valuable things, things that we want to do more of. Well, when you look at these kinds of interactions, the things that we typically do with our babies, in many ways, they're not terribly different than many of the interactions we have with dogs as well. This is one of my dogs here. This is Napoleon. And if Napoleon looks you in the eyes like that, there's not much you can do. He's captivating, and it's a really wonderful experience. So here he is gazing into the eyes of a former University of Arizona undergraduate. And when we and other scientists have looked at what happens when people interact with dogs in the same ways that we tend to interact with human babies, what we find is that this also leads to oxytocin release in people and in dogs in these contexts. One of the things that's amazing here is that there's also a feedback loop, and this has been shown elegantly through work by Mihao Nagasawa and colleagues. And what these researchers did is they essentially administered oxytocin as a drug to dogs. So dogs inhaled oxytocin up their nose, it gets across the blood-brain barrier, and it begins changing the way the dog behaves. Now, the specific way it changes dog behavior is what's interesting here. So dogs that received oxytocin started spending more time doing exactly this kind of thing, gazing into the eyes of people. It turns out that people like that, and if you look at the people's physiology in this context, the people themselves start to release more oxytocin. That in turn may change the way that they behave back towards the dog. So there's a synchronicity here, a sort of mechanism in which each partner can dial up the other's response. Now, I've talked about oxytocin, but oxytocin is actually part of a two neuropeptide system. These two neuropeptides work together, the other one being vasopressin. And the actions of oxytocin and vasopressin are complex. They depend on lots of things, and I'm going to have to slightly oversimplify here. But in many cases, the actions of oxytocin or the effects of oxytocin and vasopressin can be opposite one another. So in many cases, oxytocin acts to decrease our response to stress. It can lower blood pressure. It acts as an antioxidant in the body. It can facilitate the healing of physical wounds. And it can literally promote heart health by converting undifferentiated stem cells into cardiomyocytes. Vasopressin, on the other hand, tends to increase our response to stress as well as our susceptibility to stress. It raises our blood pressure. It increases inflammation in the body. And there's an idea in science that there's a sort of delicate balance between oxytocin and vasopressin, a sort of yin and yang dynamic where both neuropeptides work together, but the consequences can depend on which of these molecules is leading the dance. When oxytocin leads the way, the idea is that we find ourselves in states of reduced anxiety. We are actively able to deal with stress when we confront stress, and we're resilient from stress when we experience it. When vasopressin leads the way, this can lead to heightened states of anxiety, and over chronic exposure to these kinds of states can potentially lead to things like anxiety disorders. When vasopressin leads the way, we have more passive mechanisms of coping with stress, which in the long term may lead to states like depression, and we have high susceptibility to stress. So we've recently looked at both of these molecules in tandem in interactions between dogs and people. These up here are data from dogs. And what we find is that not only do dogs have this increase in oxytocin that I was talking about a moment ago, but also that they have a pretty big decrease in vasopressin concentrations. So it looks like both molecules that make up this neuroendocrine system are responding in a way that sort of tilts the balance towards oxytocin. And we think that there could be really important health consequences of these kinds of mechanisms. We don't yet know whether people interacting with dogs have a similar decrease in vasopressin concentrations, but it's something that we're working on now. And as a matter of fact, we would love it if you could help us figure out the answer. So we're currently doing research looking at child interactions with dogs. So if you or somebody you know has a child between the ages of 8 and 10 years and they have a dog at home and you want to participate, we'd love to hear from you. You can visit us online at dogs.arizona.edu or send us an email to dogkidsstudy@email.arizona.edu. We also have folks from my lab who will be in the lobby as you exit tonight, so if you're interested in any of this and you want to get involved in our work, look for the people in the Arizona Canine Cognition Center shirts and they'll be happy to talk to you about this. The work that I've talked about in the second part of the talk tonight is really part of a broader body of research that recognizes that many of the most important social relationships we have in life may not necessarily always be with other people. And I think perhaps now more than ever, this is a really important thing to take stock of and think about the consequences of. Because we live in a time where increasing numbers of people suffer from chronic loneliness. So much so that, for example, in the United Kingdom, they have appointed a minister of loneliness in response to what they call a loneliness epidemic. Right here in the United States, this is a quote from a former Surgeon General who says, during my years caring for patients, the most common pathology I saw was not heart disease or diabetes. It was loneliness. So our relationships with dogs, which endure both the best of times and the worst of times, may turn out to be much more important than many would have thought. And I think it's so important that we continue to understand the biology of this special connection between our species. Stepping back and in closing tonight, I want to recognize just how much ground we've covered, because we began this talk by thinking about how it is that our ancestors and some rogue population of wolves crossed paths more than 10,000 years ago and set off the series of events that have led us to where we are today. And no doubt, the way that we have related to dogs has changed in important ways across that period, but the fundamental connection between our species is something that has gone unbroken. And I think it's no accident that this has worked out so well. And one of the things I hope to have convinced you of is that dogs have a range of cognitive and emotional characteristics that allow them to engage in remarkable forms of communication, cooperation, and ultimately companionship with people. And I, for one, feel very lucky to live in a world that we share with these remarkable animals. Thank you.
Wow, is that great? I hope to see you next Thursday. Maria Nieves Cedeno will be talking about the natural history of bison. Thank you all for coming. Bye-bye.